Evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to welcome you to Rice University and the Baker Institute for what is our inaugural Civic Scientist Lecture. And I'm particularly happy that this first lecture in our series will be presented by my very good friend and colleague and the current director of the National Science Foundation, the Honorable Dr. Arden Bement. Now, before introducing Dr. Bement, I want to thank our sponsor for this lecture, the Arch and Stella Rowan Foundation, because without their generous support, the event would not be possible. This Civic Scientist speaker series, including tonight's event, has been organized by the Baker Institute Science and Technology Policy Program, which aspires to bring together scientists, policymakers, and business and community leaders to stimulate discussion over important issues such as the future of science and technology or public understanding of science in areas like nanotechnology, for example, medical research, including embryonic stem cell research, access to health care, particularly in our state of Texas, the tension between science and belief systems, for example, evolution, creationism, intelligent design, scientific integrity in the creation and the use or the abuse of scientific knowledge, underrepresentation in the science and engineering workforce, for example, efforts to increase the role of women and underrepresented minorities in science and engineering, or science and math engineering education, clearly related to all of the above, and many others. Science and Technology program is managed by Dr. Kirsten Matthews, whom many of you know. One of the newest projects of the Science and Technology Policy Program is the Civic Science Lecture Series, which consists of a lecture, a one-day program of meetings with students, faculty, and administrators, and Baker Institute scholars and fellows, by leading scientists, engineers, and other technical professionals whom we are calling civic scientists. We define the civic scientist as one who uses his or her special scientific knowledge and skills, and sometimes fame, to influence public policy and to engage a curious public in discussions about the wonders and the importance of science and technology. And by scientists, we, of course, include natural and social scientists, mathematicians, computer scientists, engineers, medical researchers, and many others who advance our understanding of nature and of the world of human activity. The goal of this series is to expose Rice and Houston communities to such accomplished individuals who have promoted science and technology, broadly defined as the public good, worthy of all our support. Examples of civic scientists, the predecessors, if you like, of Dr. Bement, are Benjamin Franklin, who was America's first great scientist, known especially for his experiments on electricity, and his ability to communicate his science to the country. And furthermore, he even gave up his science, which he very much loved, to help create a nation for us, which we enjoy. We're celebrating the 300th anniversary of Franklin's birth in 1706 this year. The second example would be the late and great scientist Rick Smalley, who used his prestige as co-discoverer of Buckminster fullerene with Rice's Robert Curl and Harry Croto of the UK and fellow Nobel laureate to educate the public and policymakers about the need for finding new energy technologies, perhaps emerging from nanotechnology, to address the world's looming energy problem. And our speaker tonight, who uniquely, I think, exemplifies these principles of the civic scientist. Dr. Arden Bement, a metallurgical engineer by training, is what I will call a triple threat civic scientist. He has distinguished careers in industry, the academy, and government, and therefore he has a perspective very few of the rest of us have. His career also has included management, administrative leadership in positions serving as the David A. Ross Distinguished Professor of Nuclear Engineering and head of the School of Nuclear Engineering at Purdue University, director of the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, a truly remarkable agency that works at the interface between the federal government and industry. And his current job as director of my favorite agency, the National Science Foundation. Indeed, for a while, Arden Bement ran both agencies at the same time, just kind of a more than full-time job, I would say. He has, of course, been called upon to serve on numerous boards and advisory committees, including the National Science Board from 1989 to 1995 and the U.S. National Commission for UNESCO and vice chair of its Natural Sciences and Engineering Committee, and many others. As director of the National Science Foundation, Dr. Bement has been a strong advocate for science and engineering research and education. He has helped promote increases in the National Science Foundation budget through the President's American Competitiveness Initiative and has brought a sense of community to the National Science Foundation, a team spirit that is so important to the effective workings of any organization. So let me close with a personal note. Arden was on the National Science Board when I arrived at NSF. I was a very green new member of the administration. There were some difficult issues to deal with. There had been some tense times at NSF and with the National Science Board. And Arden was most supportive of my early efforts to find my way, and he was a very voice of reason during some very difficult debates. And for that and for all he has done and continues to do for science, engineering, education, and for our nation, I'm enormously grateful. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Arden Bement.
Thank you, Neil, for that very kind and generous introduction. And also thank you for inviting me to come here today. I've had a wonderful day at the university and conclude that not only is Rice doing the right things, but doing the right things right. So it's been a very full and rewarding experience. It's also a sign of the quality of the university that my voice is being amplified by Bo's speakers. And I'm also honored to be a speaker at this exciting lecture series at Rice. The focus on the civil scientist makes this a series for our times. It would be a place where scientists and the public can engage in dialogue about the issues of science and technology that affect the welfare of citizens and the nation in a fast-paced global environment. As the first speaker in the series, I suppose I have the honored responsibility to shed light on the emergence of the civic scientist concept. I have titled my remarks, "When the Jobs in the Nation Change, So Do the Jobs of the Scientist." My use of the word scientist here and throughout my talk will be shorthand that includes scientists, engineers, and medical and technical professionals. The term civic scientist began with your respected colleague and old friend here at Rice, Dr. Neil Lane. At the time, Neil was serving as director of the National Science Foundation. I would first like to cast the concept in a brief historical perspective, especially for the younger generation of scientists and policy students in the audience this evening. There was a growing discussion in the mid-1990s, which continues today, about the marked transformation in the economies of developed nations and the Asian tigers, Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore. These economies were increasingly propelled by science and technology. Today, we see the same trend broadening to include India and China. The United States has perhaps the world's finest cadre of scientists and engineers, but there's been little dialogue between them and the larger public. That is how we have wound up with a public very interested in science and technology, but nevertheless knowing little about it. In fact, a growing knowledge chasm had developed between scientists and the rest of the population. Metaphorically, they lived in separate worlds. This is not a case of placing blame, but rather a matter of patterns carried over from the past. Despite this clearly contradictory situation, the march towards an increasingly sophisticated scientific and technical economy accelerated. Now you might say it's always been that way, but there is a difference between then and now. Today, a growing portion of the nation's jobs require some form of science and technology knowledge. We live in a different world today. How different? We need no more proof than a few stark statistics. Last year, human beings produced more transistors at a lower cost than they did grains of rice. In terms of consumer electronics in the world today, there are 2 billion mobile phones, 1.5 million TV sets, 1.5 billion TV sets, 820 million PCs, and 190 million Game Boys. My grandchildren have laptops, pagers, cell phones, CD players, PDAs, iPods, and they play video games. And by the year 2030, which is only 24 years from now, world oil consumption is expected to rise 50%. Now let's look at our neighbors and how this plays out. Several years ago, a friend shared an anecdote with me that illustrates this dilemma. He was meticulous about having his car serviced by the same master mechanic for years. When his oldest child got his driver's license, he gave this honey of a car to his son. My friend and his wife then bought the total digital car. When one of the digital systems went awry, he immediately took it to his trusty master mechanic, who promptly told him that he knew nothing about the newfangled cars. A few years later, the mechanic went out of business. Today, more technologists have a life cycle, many more technologies have a life cycle of just 18 months. The July 29th issue of The Economist magazine had an article titled "Technology Dinosaurs, Evolve or Die," in which they mentioned 4 giants in the computer industry that are losing ground. The article says each had a bold vision of technology, but then failed to evolve as the very innovations they pioneered became commonplace. This is the present trend, and it will increasingly be the wave of the future. Several decades ago, the social philosopher Eric Hoffer wrote, "In times of change, learners will inherit the earth, while the learned will find themselves well equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists." His prophecy picks up speed every day. Remember the story about the master mechanic. His training was for a job that no longer existed. When he lifted the hood of a new car, he was baffled. Today, industries are hungry for science and technology workers and compete with each other for talent. This talent competition is even more intense among nations and will become increasingly so in a knowledge economy. In the October 7th issue of The Economist magazine, the situation was made crystal clear. It states, "The proportion of American workers doing jobs that call for complex skills has grown 3 times as fast as employment in general. As other economies move in the same direction, the global demand for new skills will rise quickly. As nations strive to rise from the position of developing to developed, they recognize that the linchpin is always the human resource. Now it is the education and training of your workforce that in large part determines how successful you will be as a nation. The foundation for the power and wealth of economies has changed. Economic strength used to be rooted in land, physical labor, capital, and natural resources. The new formula for success is science and technology, highly trained workers, and lifelong learning to be able to participate in our changing economies. The world is going through a tectonic economic shift where more and more jobs require some understanding of science and technology. And it turns out that when the nature of everyone's job changes, so does the job of the scientist and the engineer. Researchers will always work at the frontiers of knowledge, but as society becomes more technologically intense, the role and responsibilities for those highly trained in this realm will expand. Enter the transformation to the civic scientist. The word civic is an adjective that means, according to the dictionary, of or affecting the community or the people. And this was exactly the emphasis of the new role and responsibilities of the civic in civic scientists. The concept of civic scientist was not intended to diminish the magnificent contribution of scientists over centuries and today, but rather to get scientists more broadly involved in the society that was built on their insight and intellect. First, is to create a dialogue with the public about science and technology that is, on the one hand, a process of educating the public about what they want and need to know. The flip side of the dialogue is learning to listen to what the public thinks about the directions in which our science and technology are taking us. And if you think the job of a civic scientist is to do more talking than listening, think again. The scientist should be as much the listener and the learner. In a science and technology-driven society, the civic scientist is an integrator, one who knits together what is discovered, what are the opportunities and implications of the discovery, and what is the most necessary new knowledge. The civic scientist not only reaches out, but also takes in the concerns and questions from the public. More than a quarter century ago, the late social philosopher Lewis Mumford reflected on Western civilization's technological history. To paraphrase Mumford, Western society has not only accepted new technologies, but unconditionally surrendered to them without respect to their human consequences. Since Mumford's commentary, the pattern has spread to global technology. We have reached a watershed in human history where we must develop the foresight to examine today's actions in terms of what they augur for sustaining our collective future. And so, policymakers, scientists, and the public need to understand that economics, energy, and the environment must be considered as interdependent issues as we view the planet and its inhabitants. The civic scientist is a natural bridge in this transformation. The second role and direction for civic scientists is to help advance the knowledge base of the nation's science and math teachers and their students. Scientists can be particularly helpful by assisting in the design of hands-on learning experiences for students. Hands-on learning requires involvement and creativity and has the magnetism to excite and inspire students and perhaps prompt them to choose science and engineering careers. You might question why I place such strong emphasis on hands-on learning experiences for students. Why not stick to the way my generation was taught? Some of you here this evening remember the read, memorize, and drill exercises. Despite the rote methods, our generation turned out some pretty stellar achievements. And we need to acknowledge that there will always be some things learned by rote. Now, however, we know a lot more about how people learn, especially young people. The science of learning, in which the National Science Foundation has been a pioneer, is enlightening us on how everything from how the brain processes information, to the physical environment for learning, to the knowledge that we all learn differently, to the importance of good nutrition for the developing brain, to diagnosing learning disorders quickly and providing assistance. It turns out that teaching students by the read and regurgitate method is often not the best way for them to learn. With hands-on learning, the student or team of students is presented with a problem to solve. On the student's part, this automatically evokes a series of questions which call upon creativity, cumulative learning, and innovation. Earlier this year, I had the opportunity to visit a classroom of fifth grade students involved in a hands-on interactive program called World on Wheels. It was supported by NSF, the automaker BMW, the American Association of Automotive Engineers, and the local school district. When asked before the program began what an engineer did, the students answered that he drove a train or took care of the school building. After being challenged by designing and building vehicles, learning about aerodynamic drag and friction, complete with propulsion systems and the use of recycled materials, they answered the question very differently. An engineer then became a person who designs spacecraft and builds computers. Considering global trends, this is precisely the kind of transformative experience that we need to duplicate in 15,000 school districts across the nation. And it will take the private sector and public institutions working with local school districts to make it happen. The up-and-coming workforce must have this knowledge and the concomitant skills. And this naturally brings us to the teaching of science and math in our schools. America may have the best scientists and engineers, but in comparison to many other countries, we do not have the best educated students in science and math. It is true that we have a layer of the creme de la creme at the top. There's a lot of variability. But a major portion of students in science and math are getting mediocre to marginal training in these subjects. And this is a compound problem. First, all teachers are underpaid and overworked with responsibilities that often have nothing to do with their teaching. We must commit to our teachers if we expect them to commit to our children. Second, many science and math teachers are inadequately trained for the classes assigned to them. Worse yet, there are teachers trained in everything from geography to gym who are thrown into a science and math classroom to teach. I want to commend the Houston community for the work you started in 1991 with the Model Science Lab. You were way ahead of the curve on the concept of a resident teacher for 1 year in the Lanier Middle School Model Science Lab. This experience provides teachers with a wonderful opportunity to learn and practice new skills, to analyze, critique, and polish techniques, and to explore the latest knowledge on learning. It is my understanding that close to 100 school teachers in the Houston School District have gone through this resident teacher training. I would hope that similar programs could be instituted in other school districts and states. Perhaps the saddest and most common educational outcome we see in schools is that the youngest children, who are intensely curious by nature, are being shortchanged. Children are born scientists, explorers, adventurers. That's why we think of toddlers as getting into everything. They bring these innate powers to school, and in the past they've largely been taught by methods that have actually stifled these cognitive abilities. Some tenacious young thinkers have historically defied these fences and walls, but too many students have emerged with their creativity blunted and much of their excitement for learning dulled, especially in science and math. This is a significant concern in terms of our current and future economy because the buzzword for the new global economy is innovation. Some have even suggested that innovation is the holy grail of the 21st century society. And we know that the wellspring of innovation is creativity. The last thing we want to do at any time, but especially now, is diminish curiosity and creativity in the process of teaching and learning. Several years ago, The Economist magazine did a study of innovation around the world. The study concluded that nations and companies that encouraged and rewarded risk-taking were more innovative. The survey indicated that nations with a combination of many immigrants and corporate policies of encouraging unorthodox thinking were the most innovative. A sidebar in the article said, "Risk-takers break all the rules. Trust them." Among other things, the Economist survey teaches us about two important ingredients in U.S. culture. It highlights the important role of immigration to a society and also the habit of unorthodox thinking. Some of you may ask why these are seen as advantageous. Let's look at immigration first. Immigrants are hard workers, driven to better their condition, not unlike the first immigrants who settled our nation, and the many who have come since then. Second, their diverse cultural backgrounds bring different perspectives on how to address issues and solve problems. Today, the immigrant population of the U.S. comprises 12% of our total population. And last month, the U.S. hit the 300 million population mark, which makes us the third most populous nation in the world behind China and India. A nation of many cultures is like a rich stew, where each ingredient helps to enhance the quality of the others. A previous deputy director of NSF used to characterize our nation's diversity as our ace in the hole. And as for unorthodox thinking and risk-taking, the second part of innovation, the long history of America's frontier has bred a pioneering spirit into the fabric of our national character. These characteristics have given the U.S. an innovative edge throughout its history. History also teaches us that when nations become complacent, self-assured of their position, and insular, they begin to fall behind. In the 21st century, the U.S. will need to sharpen its innovative edge in light of the increasing global competition. This is where the role of the civic scientist, a scientist of or affecting the community or the people, comes into clearer view. As many of you know, the National Science Foundation supports promising transformative frontier research and researchers by grant awards for the most superlative research proposals. These proposals are judged by outside panels of scientists. In the late 1990s, the Foundation revised this merit review process so that grants were awarded based on 2 fundamental criteria instead of 1, and Dr. Lane was part of that transformation. The first criterion is the intellectual merit of the proposal to explore and advance the science. This first category has been the basis of the NSF merit review process since the Foundation's inception. The second is wider in scope and closely connected to the principles of civic science. We refer to it as the criteria for broader impact of the research or the researcher. In a sense, these are activities that have a ripple effect out in the larger populace. Criterion 2 helps scientists think more broadly about their work. The science is always critical and must be of the highest caliber, but Criterion 2 stretches the science and/or the scientist. An example would be to integrate research activities or hands-on learning into the teaching of science, math, and engineering at all education levels, from K to 12 to higher education for science and non-science majors. A completely different example of a broader impact activity would be to give science and engineering presentations to the broader community, such as in museums, libraries, and radio shows, and to groups like the League of Women Voters, Rotary Clubs, and the like. I wonder how many scientists are members of Rotary Clubs. It's important to understand that a response to the broader impact criteria is not optional, it's mandatory. Any proposal that arrives without a response to broader impact will be automatically returned. So this must be construed as an explicit policy direction of the National Science Foundation. As you probably have already discerned, broader impact goes hand in glove with a philosophy underpinning the role of the civic scientist. It gives the researcher submitting the proposal the impetus to think beyond the science to the larger society. In order to encourage the most creative thinking about broader impact, we have specifically tried not to box it in, but rather to give the researcher free rein of his or her imagination. I know that all of you in the Houston area are familiar with Café Scientifique, the exciting new movement that has come to America from Europe. This is a perfect example of scientists engaging in dialogue with the public and to make science accountable to the populace. The National Science Foundation is sponsoring a Café Scientifique in Arlington, Virginia. We've been very fortunate to attract scientist speakers who are not only articulate, but also down to earth about relating their subject. They are good storytellers and like being challenged. Having a sense of humor also goes a long way to being a crowd pleaser. On another dimension, I know that there are students in the audience this evening in the natural or social sciences or engineering, and perhaps in the arts and humanities, who are interested in a possible career in public policy as a way to make a difference in the world. I am reminded of the wisdom of Dr. Jonas Salk, who said, "Our greatest responsibility is to be good ancestors." He wanted each of us to think about how we could leave the planet and its inhabitants in a better condition than we found it. To me, this does not mean that any single individual must solve some gigantic world problem, but rather that each of us should choose a small piece of a big problem and make a difference. You may wish to find that piece in sub-Saharan Africa, but you can just as easily find it in Houston or Boston or rural Maine or New Mexico. Sometimes if you change a direction or policy in one community, like Houston's Model Science Lab, it becomes a model for other places, and soon it spreads like a vine, and you know where it began. And never be afraid of trying something for fear that it may not work out the way you planned. Remember what I said earlier about thinking creatively and taking risks, and how this has helped make America great. The risk taker transports us to a whole new set of ideas and places. Find a problem and tackle it on a small scale first. Think of Mohammed Yunus, the Bangladeshi economist who just won the Nobel Peace Prize for fighting poverty. He established a system of microcredit to the poorest Bangladeshis, mostly women. A loan of the smallest amount of money allowed these women to start small businesses. These women had close to 100% payback rate. Think about that. Yunus has also suggested that China establish a similar practice. This small-scale effort could someday radically change the economy in the developing world. In the longer view, it is my belief that civic scientists, however you may choose to define the term, can bring us closer to that goal. Thank you.
So we have some questions, and if more occur to you, please jot them down. There's some more questions over here. We need some cards over here.
This reminds me,
please,
Neil, of inquiry-based learning.
Okay, sorry?
This reminds me of the usual perception of inquiry-based learning. You ask the questions and I answer.
Well, I get one question. There are going to be so many questions, I'm not going to get one in. So you mentioned Criterion 2, Arden, and my impression was when that was first put in place, a lot of scientists did not like it. And I'm wondering whether the situation's any different today.
The short answer is no.
Thank you. Sorry I asked. Okay.
The longer answer is we're still trying to improve it, and also to get common standards across the foundation, but it's always a challenge.
Is the job of a scientist in the USA harder than Europe, Asia, because of religiosity, is the question.
Well, that's a very provocative question. Is it harder because of religiosity? I think the practice of science is not harder because of that. I think scientists understand the difference between science and a belief, and it's equally as hard in other countries for different reasons, so I wouldn't credit that too strongly.
Rice is seen as the Central University in nanotechnology research and education. What do you see as the greatest opportunities and threats posed by nanotechnology in the near, mid, and long term?
Well, I think the greatest opportunities really have to do with improving the environment, making potable water more available around the world, removing toxic elements from water and from other substances, and also in medical applications such as killing cancer tumors. And as we know, it could have a major impact on energy and energy sustainability. The major issues really have to do with public perception of ethical and moral values, the fear factor of nanorobots, and also potential toxic and environmental impacts. I can certainly say that Rice has provided leadership in trying to understand the toxicology dimension. And much of the best work that's in the literature comes from research here at Rice. And I think the reason why the research is so credible is because of the care of characterizing the particles before looking at the toxicology effects. And it's not just looking at the dimensions of the particles, which is in itself very difficult at the nanoscale. It's also understanding surface charge and how those properties change. The physical chemistry of the particles change in different transport stages. We have a lot to learn in that area, and we need to have the rest of the world pay attention to this as well. And fortunately, through our efforts of getting international collaboration in these 4 areas of ethics, morals, human toxicology, as well as environment, we are making good progress.
What's the role of the social sciences today?
I thought you'd never ask. In this technological society, there's hardly any technology or any impact of technology that doesn't involve the social and behavioral scientist. Social science has in the past been characterized as being the soft science. It was always the hard science. It had nothing to do with common sense. It had a lot to do with uncommon sense. I could give you many examples, but there's a heavy demand for the role of the social scientist in almost every field of science, but also with almost every federal agency. And we're finding more and more opportunities to thread social and behavioral science through all our programs at NSF. And it's a two-way street. It's not just the social scientist informing the physical scientist, but it's the physical scientist also informing the social scientist, and both benefit. And so in many respects, the social scientist will play a significant role in the advancement of physical science and natural science in general. So it's just as critical for us to appreciate the effect of social science on human-machine interaction, the use of computers, the development of virtual networks, and how communities work together at every scale, from the small scale to the local scale to the national scale to the international scale. And so I have a passion about this, as you can probably tell.
Do you believe research should be more applied? And I think that means in the context of NSF, should more attention be given to applied research? And then there's a second question: how does Criterion 2 affect the balance between basic and applied research, if indeed it does?
Well, let me say first of all that the Foundation's primary mission is the support of fundamental basic research and to stay connected with the frontier. But it's also incumbent upon the Foundation to work with other agencies so that there is collaboration and handoff of new scientific concepts to application. And the same also applies to the private sector. The Foundation is the only federal agency outside of the National Institutes of Health that really has that primary mission. And if we back away from the frontier and move too far downstream, we do a disservice, I think, to the nation. Now, that has nothing to say about the role of universities in coupling frontier pioneering basic research with applied research. It's critically important because those applications shorten the lead time from discovery to public benefit. And that is a role of universities as well.
There's been much discussion about U.S. science and math education shortcomings for many years, and no single government agency has full responsibility. So what's the best way to coordinate these efforts and bring real improvement?
First of all, the Constitution assigns to the states the responsibility for education, not the federal government. But the federal government does have a role in supporting education broadly, but it needs to be done in partnership with the states. If we get too divergent in developing standards and methods of training teachers, both pre-service and in-service, it doesn't necessarily provide the alignment that's necessary to advance education across the country. So the National Science Foundation has a role to play, and that role is research and education. We are a research agency. We're not an implementer of education. That is a role of the Department of Education through their grants programs, is to assist the states in implementing standards and new teaching methods, new instructional materials, and so forth. So it's incumbent upon the Foundation and the Department of Education to work closely together. On the one hand, we try to understand what works, and the role of the Department of Education is to make what works work more broadly across the country. But even if you took all the resources available to the Foundation and the Department of Education, it's only a small fraction of the total. We probably touch about 1,000 or 2,000 school districts around the country. The Foundation only touches maybe 400 to 600. There are 15,000 school districts. So it really comes back to taking best practices that come about as a result of the research that NSF does, and the practices that the Department of Education support, and the best practices that they put on their website to build a brush fire and to extend those best practices throughout the country. But that has to be the responsibility of the state governments. The state governor is the chief education officer, believe it or not, and also local government, local communities. And our experience is that when the private sector gets involved, and I'm talking about not commitment, but involvement, engagement, it makes all the difference in the world. And part of my missionary work is to get the private sector from commitment to engagement.
Oh, here's a softball. Is stem cell research going to move forward with the Democratic Congress and Senate?
Well, it is a softball because the best work on that subject is done right here at the Baker Institute, and it's been well published, and I almost had time to read it.
How can scientists play a greater and more immediate role in bridging the health disparities that exist in global as well as the national and local level? Well,
that's such a broad question, and it really addresses the role and mission of the National Institutes of Health more than the National Science Foundation, but it doesn't exclude the National Science Foundation because there are many ways in which the NSF and the National Institutes of Health work very closely together. And many of those ways have to do with bioengineering, biophysics, biochemistry, bioinformatics, and ways to bring the power of math and physics and chemistry to bear on understanding the bio world at every level through the tree of life. And there are very, very many rapid advances that will lead to new cures, that will lead to advances in medicine. And it's vitally important to sustain the work in those areas. But I still am of the belief that preventative medicine is far more important than curative medicine. So putting more focus on prevention, I think, is critically important if we are going to be able to afford good medical care in this country.
You mentioned the importance of diversity, or the value of diversity, and, for example, in bringing into our country immigrants from other parts of the world and so forth. Women also bring additional perspectives and diverse views. So how do you see the role of women and increasing the role of women? And in particular, how does the National Science Foundation address these issues?
One of our top priorities is broadening participation, and not only demographically, but also geographically. And it also means bringing women and underrepresented minorities and people with disabilities into the science and engineering enterprise. And we have a long way to go. So it's work in progress. But we continue to emphasize that we continue to give it priority. And we continue to invest in institutional change to take away barriers to advancement for these people. I have a perception that if we want to increase the number of women and the number of underrepresented minorities in science and engineering, we have to convey to them the relevance of what they're investing their career in. And social relevance is critically important. And I think we do not do a very good job of that, especially in the high schools.
There's a specific question about, which I haven't yet asked, but about middle school. Is there particular importance, and are there particular programs to try to reach girls, young women in earlier grades and through middle school?
Well, there's been a lot written on that subject, and I don't want to get into a long discourse. Middle school is a problem area. It's a puberty mill in many respects. And, attitudes change, outlooks on the world change. And that is an area where it's particularly important to have outstanding teachers and also mentoring to generate interest in learning. But again, this is where hands-on learning can really play a role in sustaining interest and also sustaining retention, because that's where retention problems begin, and they only get exacerbated later in the process. So as an example, there are many university schools around the country. Many universities adopt a school as part of their education program. And invariably, universities adopt high schools. Howard University adopted a middle school because they wanted the challenge. And it was especially a challenge because in the District of Columbia, they have to have open enrollment. So they have to accept anyone that comes to the door. And in many instances, the level of preparation is anywhere from 1 to 2 grades behind. Now, they have insisted, and they've actually brought about, a teaching faculty that is superb. Every teacher that teaches math or science has to have a degree in math or science, and some teachers have master's degree. The school is fully wired. Every student has a laptop. The classrooms have the largest flat screen projectors you could possibly imagine. They have digitized all the content, all the CD content, and that can be called up by any teacher with a computer on her desk and incorporated in her classroom or his classroom presentation. So what they're finding is that by paying attention to details and by motivating and exciting students and learning, and hands-on learning is part of it, they're able to bring all the students up to a common standard after the first 2 semesters of the first year that they're in middle school. And by the time they finish at 9th grade, they're anywhere from 1 or 2 grades ahead of the average performance of almost any other middle school in the region. Now, this is a clear example of where a lot of the problems we hear about can be tackled, but it requires, among anything else, competent and inspiring teachers. And of course, technology doesn't hurt either.
You mentioned that science teaching is not satisfactory. What are some of the reasons? How can we improve the standards? And let me link to that a question of someone who, a young person in the audience who remembers the Feynman Zacharias type programs, the PSSC, some of the early programs that I think were certainly praised that the National Science Foundation offered, and finally testing. So I guess the issue is what's not satisfactory about science teaching? What about these standardized tests that are certainly criticized by many folks, including many folks in this state? And, well, let me end there.
Well, again, to give a short response, I think the primary factor are teachers that are not enthusiastic about their subject and can't convey enthusiasm, as well as knowledge about the subject matter. And all it takes is about 2 such teachers to totally turn off a student in math and science.
How many does it take to turn on a really good student?
Some do. Texas does. I mean, here you have District 1 in Houston, you have District 9 in El Paso, and you found out how to deal with that. It's a great success story.
There is a question along that line as whether you mentioned the example, one hands-on learning experience certainly changed the attitudes about some young people about engineering, but to really get the sort of change that at least in your opinion is important, how much hands-on learning is enough?
Well, I don't know that I could generalize that question. I think that depends a little bit on the grade level. It depends on the cognitive skills at that stage of development. It's not yet known what science ought to be taught in elementary school and how early it should be taught. It's not even clear the sequence of teaching science. Does it always follow that biology should be taught first? Why not physics first and biology last? These are some questions that still don't have answers.
2 last quick ones, I think. One, what role does intellectual property play in promoting civic science, and what agency or part of government should be setting that policy?
Well, the policy on intellectual property, of course, is the Patent and Trademark Office in the Department of Commerce. But I think the issue on intellectual property in many other countries is not the public policy or the laws on the book, it's the enforcement. And in many countries that we trade with, they don't have a legal profession in many respects that even have a clue on how to adjudicate infringements or intellectual property law. And that's where there has to be much more cooperation and much more transfer of knowledge. And I think many countries are now beginning to realize that if they want their economy to grow and if they want to get the full benefit of advances in science and technology, they do have to pay attention to intellectual properties.
Okay, last question. There are 7 of these. So what I propose doing is I'll quickly sort of indicate what they're about and then let you make your final comment on those or anything else. So one question refers to the really extraordinary development, I think, of microelectronics and of microeconomics in Bangladesh, and the question whether that might have some application in our own communities. Another one is, can you increase the amount of money for informal education? And will you do that? That's a direct question. How do scientists really learn to listen, if that's an important part of civic science? And should the U.S. be concerned take steps to keep from falling behind in science and technology, and how can more students be encouraged to study science? Because I think there's some feeling among our students who are coming from other countries that maybe they see their counterparts in class not working quite as hard as they're used to working. Any piece of that, Arden, and then we'll close out.
I suppose you want something more profound than yes, yes, no, yes, no. Let me have the question so I can.
I think I've shuffled them.
Let me take informal science and education first. Up until now, we've informed the public about science and engineering, and we've informed students about science and engineering. We haven't engaged them. We now have the capability to engage students in the conduct of science and education. The International Polar Year, which is going to begin next March, is a case in point. We really want to bring the excitement of exploration, the excitement of research in the polar regions into the classroom. And we have a number of grants that will do just that. We want to engage students and teachers in the Arctic and the Antarctic in some of the research that will be done. And of course, there'll be abundant programs, including a lot of penguins, that will generate a lot of human interest. So the answer is yes, we are increasing our investment in informal education, not only to provide more outreach to the public at large, and also to engage students directly in science, but we're also investing more in trying to integrate the two, integrate informal with formal education, because the few areas where we've done research in this subject, it really does amplify the impact of the education, but it also sustains the interest in the education beyond the classroom. And of course, that's what we would all like to achieve. The experiment in Bangladesh, will that work in the United States? It has worked. Probably not on the scale that was effective in Bangladesh, but somewhat larger scale. Yes, those kind of investments for economic development are very, very important. And we have made it, we have seen advantages. I mean, you've seen advantages of wireless communication in Houston. So these are important lessons learned. Have scientists learned? Well, I take that to mean as far as the civic scientist is concerned.
Yeah, I think the interest is, how do you teach a scientist to listen, which strikes me as a very difficult question to answer. But
well, I think scientists listen. They listen to each other. You know, they listen to me all day. But I'm not sure that they're well tuned into the public at large yet. Some are, some aren't. There needs to be more engagement. So that was the thesis behind my talk this evening.
Would you close with a comment, Arden, on the related to scientists listening and engaging in dialogue with the public, which is the sort of central theme of your remarks, the issue of belief systems that many people hold and hold deeply in science. What's our challenge so that what does not appear to emerge as some kind of overt conflict between science and religion in our society or any society in the world?
Well, that's a very good question. I think a partial answer to that is that people seek their own ways in getting through this life, overcoming grief, meeting day-to-day challenges, And we can't, for the moment, assume that science and technology is going to provide all the answers or all the values that are necessary to help people in those circumstances. So I think we have to be a little bit humble and recognize that there are a number of ways. We have to be a little tolerant in having open discussion about the matter. But I think the notion that emergent behavior, or intelligent design, I've been on another track all day. Intelligent design is science, I think, is patently wrong. And I think more of the public is beginning to understand that. And that is the difference between the scientific method and a belief system. And I'll leave it there.
Let me say what a wonderful day it's been for us. Arden has engaged from breakfast this morning in a very, I would say, rich exchange of ideas, which has been much appreciated by all of us in the Rice community, and including this event this evening. So I would like to again offer my thanks to you for all that you're doing, and especially today for being on our campus and engaging in these comments and giving this presentation this evening.
Well, thank you, Neil. This has been a rich opportunity to visit Rice after many years. It was a very rich day, and I thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So let's thank our speakers.